Hello and welcome to In Search of Black Power. I'm Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research for Legions of a Beautiful Struggle.
I'm Rasheen, social scientist and independent scholar.
So someone once said there's three types of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. So this phrase is used to sort of elucidate how statistics can be framed in ways to be entirely misleading, even though they claim to be objectively factual. So the implications of these lies in terms of statistics are magnified, potentially when it comes to black people in our condition. So recently, Rashim and I both read this book, No BS, and BS stands for bad stats. Black people need people who believe in black people enough not to believe every bad thing they hear about black people. A interesting book with a long title from Howard University's Ivory Toldson. And we saw what's just really interesting. We're both researchers. We both do things related to statistics. And he has a whole book basically explaining how these seemingly objective statistics can be used to perpetuate negative narratives and stereotypes around black people. One example in the book that we're going to come back to at the end is the statistic floating around that there are more black men in jail than they are in college. And as a professor, Dr. Toldson actually breaks down the data and says that's just objectively not true. So a funny thing actually happened after Dr. Toldson disproved this bad stat. The people who created it, the Justice Policy Institute, actually said, oh, we'll look into it, but never actually acknowledged that it was wrong because they were getting a lot of media coverage off of this very salacious stat, which told a bunch of people what they thought they already knew about black men. So given that one example and the other things in the book and just our personal experience, the question that I wanted to present to the viewers today is, how are statistics used as an instrument for the subjugation of African people? And what do we need to know not to fall into the bad stats trap? So I want to hand it over to you and have you lead us for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the way that Toldson framed the book and even framed the conversation around statistics is he talks about how it's important about how we look at what exactly is the problem. Because how we look at the problem or what we say the problem or the issue or the condition is determines what our research method is, what our question is, what are we comparing, how are we analyzing information. What seems to happen so many times and what you alluded to a few moments ago is depending upon how we frame the question, it ends up perpetuating in a lot of situations the pathology of black people, right? So it's framed in a way of like, what's wrong with black people? And one of the things that he also brings up, particularly in this particular book that's talking about stats, is achievement. Black achievement. And more specifically, we tend to hear that conversation talked about as the Black achievement gap, right? And so when you say it's a gap, it already puts us in a situation where we're being compared to another race. They're being seen as the standard by which we should try to achieve. One of the things he argues in the book is to take the approach of looking at just Black achievement, period, within group achievement and all of the things that may contribute to that particular situation. So I really liked the starting of that framing. He talks also a bit about good data, the importance of good data, but not just having good data, but also having thoughtful analysis and also having compassion, because so often what happens with data is we are just looking at numbers, we are looking at test scores, we are not looking at these things within a context of how certain conditions impact folks. He references Du Boisian style framework of some of the work that Du Bois did when he was in Philadelphia, not looking at folks that he was interacting with as the not being looking at them as like objects.
Exactly. I mean, right? Du Bois is credited with basically inventing contemporary academic sociology. But what's left out of that conversation is what he did was more akin to an African-centered methodology of sociology than the dominant sociology that produces most of these bad stats. So Du Bois famously lived amongst the people of Philadelphia for years as he accumulated data on them as one of them. So his relationship in terms of the level of trust he was able to get, a lot of people don't want to give data to just anybody. So a lot of what we see as objective data comes out of a top-down hierarchical relationship where I don't even trust you. So I'm going to say what I think you want to hear. Or I'm going to say what I think you think is true. And there's actually a book called Dreaming Blackness by an academic named Melanie Price. And she actually says that when black people are interviewed, they basically don't express the full extent of their support for black nationalism. One of the critical variables is the perceived race of the interviewer. So when they think they're talking to a black person, they're willing to express more pro-black nationalist politics. So a lot of the sort of objective analysis about what black people want, just integrate us, just all come together, that is actually reflective of a particular relationship to academia that needs to be fundamentally questioned in terms of whether that data is actually full data.
Yeah. I think also one practice that I feel like is very Eurocentric in nature when it comes to researching folks is not letting them know what this research is about, what it will be intended for, or any of those particular things. That I think in the one of the things that I appreciate about the Boysian method is not only was he living in the community and interacting with the folks, but they knew about the research, they knew what he intended to do with it and how it would be, and exactly how it would be used. So with that backdrop or that overview, one of the things that we're going to really apply it to or investigate a little bit further is the way that Toldson talks about research as it relates to things like test scores or dropout rates and achievement overall. So I mentioned earlier how there's this problem that we have when we start to focus on achievement gap, because we're saying that one thing is a measure, or one set of folks is the measure by which we should be trying to achieve. I don't know if it was Jay-Z, help me out if it wasn't, but I think it was Jay-Z that said, who are you for me to be trying to be equal to? Like, we should just be focusing on just achievement overall. And one of the things that things like test scores and that sort of thing are used to is not only are they used as gatekeepers for access and opportunity and resources, but they're also things that route youth into special education programs, deem them as ADD. We use that information acontextually, and then we determine what path or what access and opportunity that individual youth should have.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people are using the word intersectionality a lot, but actually doing an intersectional analysis produces a lot of realizations that challenge a lot of these statistical assumptions. So Toldson actually writes in the book, 39% of black children in D.C. are living in poverty compared to 0% of white children. 90% of white children in D.C. are from families that are comfortable, as measured by having an income that is more than 5 times the rate of poverty compared to 15% of black children. So you're telling me that the gap between the percentage of white and black families who are wealthy is 75. Yet the gap between the percentages of white and black children who complete high school is only 13%. What's wrong with white people?
Right.
So by flipping the script to sort of say, despite the higher rates of poverty, we actually achieve at a level far more than you should expect, given the material reality people are situated in. When people turn it into just like, what's wrong with black men? You know, it kind of obscures the actual strengths that are allowing black people to achieve in ways that statistic doesn't actually express. And of course, one thing that Toldson says in the book is people obsess over only 20% of black men have achieved a certain proficiency, while the number for white men is only 40%. Right? So the assumption somehow is that white men must actually be at 100% proficiency because they are deemed to be the standard. So subconsciously, we see the gap as 80%,
right,
when it's really only 20%. And I think that we know that white men are doing enough to keep their wealth, even though 60% of them aren't at grade level. So the question is, proficient towards what end?
Right.
White men are getting an education sufficient enough to maintain themselves, for the most part, not that all of them are doing great, as the primary beneficiaries of our society. So what is the actual metric of what is a good education?
Right. And also, how are we measuring proficiency? Right? Like, what do we deem and what do we say is proficient when we're looking at things like reading? Also, how culturally relevant is the text that youth are engaging with? And I know you had something to say on the conditions.
Yeah. So about testing. So that's one of the big things. Just wanted to give an anecdote. So I remember being in middle school, and you take a bunch of standardized tests. It's literally, are you feeling good that day?
Yeah.
And if you're not feeling good, you look bad on tests.
Yep.
And I remember there were two important tests. One, you had to pass to go to high school. The other one was you got a score, and that score determined whether you could go to one of the magnet schools. So one of them was literally pass-fail, and the other one was graded. And those numbers went into a composite score in Baltimore City that allows you to matriculate to a competitive citywide high school. So for the competitive citywide high school test, I actually got one of the highest grades in the school. But for the actual pass-fail test, I just didn't care. Like, I failed. So I failed my 7th grade year. I actually passed my 8th grade year. Because I knew it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And also, I wasn't feeling good that day. Like, stuff was crazy at home. But what happens if that had flipped? What happens if I'd been feeling really bad on the day of the competitive citywide magnet school test? My whole life trajectory would have changed based upon one bad day.
Yeah.
And we're building entire multi-billion-dollar educational decisions about things that are literally as capricious as, did your mom yell at you that morning?
Right.
Was how stuff at home particularly crazy?
Yeah.
Like, I grew up in the 90s, so it's like, if your hood was going to a gang war, that was nothing you were going to do at school. That was going to deal with the reality of the insecurity of your neighborhood. And all those things are just obscured when we talk about objective testing numbers.
I think that speaks directly to what Toldson found in his study, the factors, like some of the biggest factors that impact achievement in Black males. One was quality of life. Another one was whether or not they were tired that morning. Something as simple as that. And then also, I was kind of surprised by this one, feeling lonely.
Oh, yeah.
Like, those three things had a great impact on how they performed on tests. And overall, there's a positive correlation between academic achievement and quality of life. And I don't think that is investigated enough or like considered enough.
Just look at what people present as a solution to the achievement gap. It's a lot of times more competitive charter schools and magnet schools. If you go to a charter school or magnet school, it's not your neighborhood school. So what you got to do? You got to get up early. You got to hop on the bus.
Right.
What else do you have to do? You have to leave your friends in the neighborhood behind. So those are two of the metrics right there.
And
and that's the solution.
Yeah, and don't let you be
the problem.
Don't let you be the eldest. I was the eldest of 5. So me getting up in the morning was not just me getting me up in the morning. I'm getting me up. I'm getting my siblings up. I'm making sure we've eaten. We have to catch, they have to catch their buses in their situation. I had to catch mine. So it's a lot that goes into it that's not even considered when we're making these comparisons. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also think it's interesting in terms of the relationship with the teacher.
Yes.
And what the teacher was evaluating as a positive outcome. So just another anecdote. A lot of us in LBS come from the world of high school debate. And debate is like a 2-person form of debate that's very competitive. You travel the nation like doing a circuit of tournaments because the whole nation debates the same topic. So that allows you to actually bring students from the country to basically do debate summer camps like they do like high school debate basketball camps.
Okay.
Right? So we actually at LBS ran a 3-week residential, like staying on campus summer camp to teach largely but not exclusively Black students how to talk about social justice and debate. We named it after, at that time, imprisoned political prisoner in Baltimore, Eddie Conway, the Eddie Conway Liberation Institute. He, of course, was released in, I believe, 2014. He's doing great work in the community now. We actually got some grant funding, and they gave us an evaluation. I looked at the evaluation and said, this has absolutely nothing to do with our kids. And it's like, how much are the kids reading? It's like they're already reading a lot because they're geniuses. That's why they're here. So it basically kind of assumed like this deficit model where it's like, well, we're going to assume they don't read.
Yeah.
And you need to prove to us they're reading more when they leave your camp.
Yeah.
For our kids, it might have been the opposite because what they got from school may have not been worth reading. And now we're giving them maybe not even reading materials. A lot of YouTube videos is what we do. And we know a lot of our young people have undiagnosed dyslexia.
Right.
So the YouTube videos might actually be a better source of learning, especially because the YouTube videos might come from like Dr. John Henrik Clark, Dr. Amos Wilson, people who are excluded from the Eurocentric canon.
Yeah.
And that would actually be deemed as a step backwards on the evaluation. And another example I give is a lot of evaluations include things like, what are the recommendations from their teachers? What do they say after they come back from camp? Our kids, when they come back from camp, they might be more confrontational with the teacher. Because it's like, I don't believe that. I don't think Columbus discovered America.
Right.
And that would actually be deemed as a negative on their evaluation, where for us it's a positive. So when you talk about, again, like objective evaluation, it depends on the relationship with the teacher to actually be able to determine what is the desired outcome, and the community having the power to set those metrics themselves.
Mm-hmm. I think in looking at things like evaluations and how we write, again, what the problem is, and one of the ways in which we sometimes end up perpetuating this Black pathology is Black academics and folks in the nonprofit arena. They get grants, they get money, they get promoted based on poor Black people doing really bad. So sometimes when the story is written or when the evaluation is done, it's like, we're not doing good, we're not doing great, we need grant funds, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of like having a strength-focused model to say, these are some of the strengths, this is why we might need resources to enhance that, or looking at what is actually effectively working. Mm-hmm. So there's sometimes where we some folks in our own communities buy into these evaluations and these stories. Yeah. Because a lot of times it may serve a person individually, mm-hmm. and they might claim to be doing participatory research, but actually aren't. And it's all in the framing.
Yeah. It's a weird, the phrase perverse incentive, not perverse in terms of sexuality, but perverse in terms of like weirdly contradictory and leading to a negative outcome. So the perverse incentive is, if you are trying to get money to help Black people, mm-hmm. you have an incentive to make Black people look totally down bad, totally messed up, totally broken, even if the statistics are more complicated than that in reality.
Right.
Because first of all, it tugs at the heartstrings of the white people who control a lot of the money and the Black people that control a lot of the money.
Right.
But it also sets you up for success because you set the baseline so low. Mm-hmm. So you have an incentive to say, oh, none of our kids are graduating. None of our kids is learning nothing. Mm-hmm. So if I teach a kid anything, by comparison, I look like a genius. Right. So we have this weird norming of Black failure. Mm-hmm. And it sort of gets perpetuated in terms of, well, it's good for everybody. It's good for me because I'm getting money to help Black kids. Mm-hmm. It's good for the Black kids because they have more people helping them. Mm-hmm. But the actual methodologies that you use to address pathology are different than the methodologies you use to inculcate genius.
Yeah.
And the methodologies you use to inculcate methodologies for assimilation are different than the methodologies you use to inculcate characteristics for resistance. Mm-hmm. So again, if our assumption is that whatever white people do must be what we teach our kids to do, then the unique skills that we need to be able to resist our condition, white people don't as much need to teach their folks that because they largely benefit from that system. Mm-hmm. So it just goes back to that, I think it's an Asada quote. It's like, why would you expect a system built for your oppression to educate you on how to destroy it? Mm. And unfortunately, I think that's the underlying assumption behind what a lot of people are presenting as the social justice, nonprofit, statistical research industrial complex around Black people.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah. One of the things too that Toldson talks about is looking at things like the graduation rate versus the dropout rate, and how to like actually read that and know exactly what it's saying. Some of the things that it doesn't really give consideration to is like children leaving high school or they're leaving the district to attend another school outside of the district, and how that makes the whole district scores go down. But because that's not taken into consideration, it just looks like they're just dropping out. Yeah. Not like I'm changing districts or going to another school. Also, when we look at things like the cohort graduation rate calculations, it doesn't include youth who are students who graduate later, who graduate early, who obtain a GED, or who transfer. I would fit into the category when I was in college as I probably would have made that score negative because I didn't graduate within 4 years. Because they just look at, if you graduate within 4 years, that's how they look at your graduation rate. And a lot of folks that I know and I interact with, they may have taken 6 years to complete, but they still completed, but that's not included in the original.
And you're talking about your college experience versus your high school.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of this is focused on high school. And the question is why? Yeah. Because we have a huge issue of people getting college debt and not graduating. But that's not talked about as much as the high school dropouts.
Yeah.
Because there is that assumption that high school dropouts correlate to violence.
Right.
So again, that pathology focus. But the other piece of it is that, of course, schools get funded by how many kids go to those schools. So you have the teachers' unions being very adamant about dealing with high school dropout rates because there are less kids in their schools, they get less funding, right? So, I mean, that's worth talking about, that's a real thing, but the issue is more complex than that. Because for Toldson in D.C., what's one of the big things he's talking about? Black people being gentrified out of D.C. and therefore they look like they're dropping out of DC public schools. They're not dropping out of school. They're going to school in PG County.
Right.
And the reality is, for some people, going to school in PG County might be better for them because, we have at least potentially more control over those schools. We actually at LBS work with a homeschooling cooperative in Prince George's County in Maryland. And these are young people who are doing debate through homeschooling. Many of them read above grade level. But you would never know that because the teachers union doesn't have an incentive to talk about that because those homeschool kids don't count for the people in schools. They don't count in terms of money for the teachers unions and the high schools. So the reality is, this Wilson Baker homeschooling cooperative has kids doing very well, and you wouldn't know it because they don't fit within the statistical lens that focuses on dropout rates. In fact, some of them may look like high school dropouts because they left DC public schools. So we just have this reality where we have this system that isn't designed to actually measure what's happening to us. It's designed to measure what is happening to us by proxy of how it impacts institutions that we don't control, be it the teachers unions, high schools, the nonprofits, the foundations. If they perceive the possibility of black deviance increasing, they're like, oh man, I'm going to have to pay for that down the line. So they're willing to engage us on that, but not on actually inculcating security. And I think that deals with some of the gender issues, right? Because black men are seen as potential supercriminals. So their failure to graduate high school is seen as a threat, as opposed to, black women, they may graduate, but do they have college graduation rates? Are they going into the service economy and being destroyed by a exploitative service economy? Do they have the support they need to raise children? Those issues are not elevated as much because the perceived danger of black women isn't that they, join a gang and shoot somebody. So it's weird. I think people almost see that as like black male privilege, but it's like you're privileging the pathology or the perspective pathology of black men, not their actual flourishing.
Yeah, I will say in some studies that I've conducted around, and this was actually studies on black motherhood, but I was studying black mothers of daughters and black mothers of sons. And we were able to look at some things qualitatively and then also look at some things quantitatively and almost even put a percentage or a numeric count on how privilege showed up, whether that was male privilege or white privilege or what have you. One of the things that came up for black women in the studies that I did that were mothers of sons is that while maleness operated as a privilege or benefit for white mothers, it operated as a liability for black mothers and made their interactions with their sons like just a bit more hyper and it shows up differently. So there is a way when you racialize gender, it shows up differently, and it's not necessarily a privilege in that way. It ends up being more of a liability. I will say, to the point of gender, and I talked to you about this. I think I texted you this earlier in the week. One of the critiques that I do have, particularly of chapter 4 and 5, he titles the sections "Black Students Don't Read," and then the other one is. What is chapter 5? Black students are dropping out, right? So you have it framed black students, but all of or majority of the information that is in there says black male. And there is this way in which sometimes when we are talking about black people, what it means to be black, it means to be a man, and what it means to be a woman is to be white. And sometimes I feel like black women feel completely left out of the conversation, or there's this generalization that is made, like he's saying black students, but he cites and he says the word black male or black man 25 times in one page on a section that's supposed to be about black people, but specifically identifies black men. That's one of the things that I feel like I wish that was given more consideration. If he's going to say black males, then also say black girls or just say black people and include all of the data. Yeah. But when he got really specific, he really focused largely. All of these statistics that I'm looking at are black male.
Yeah, and the question is, what is the conversation? Like, I wish the conversation was how do we inculcate flourishing in our use of all genders. But I think the conversation too much amongst our community, and I think what he's probably hearing when he goes to community associations in D.C. or even nonprofit meetings, is what's wrong with these black boys, right? So it's that, again, perceived threat of black men who fall out of the system is that an obsession over their potential threat to society, as opposed to, again, it's like what black boys might need to feel less lonely might be different than what black women might need to feel less lonely.
Yeah.
But he knows that for black men, loneliness is a critical metric. But we should study that for everybody because, again, you may need very different things, given gender socialization, to deal with that variable in achievement. Right. So, again, it's like I wish we could actually have that conversation.
Yeah.
But we too often, even amongst ourselves, aren't having that conversation because, unfortunately, we can't get paid to have that conversation. We can't get paid to have the, if you don't do what I'm saying, that kid's going to go to jail. And you're going to have to pay for them to live in a jail cell conversation. Because it's really about this, the state governments, especially after the financial crash in 2008, they got really freaked out because they saw huge prison populations, increased poverty, decreased jobs, which meant they were going to have to build more prisons, and that's on their dime. Staffing the prison, paying for its construction, that's on the state government's dime. And the state government coffers were shrinking because of the Great Recession. So a huge chunk of this prison reform, new Jim Crow, all this stuff, it's not about caring about black men. It's about, it's cheaper to have them get a GED and get a job than put them in a jail cell. So weirdly, I think that's a lot of the, again, perverse reality of what's happening in our community. And it kind of gets to the last anecdote I wanted to present around statistics and bad stats, was an experience I had with the exact same group that Toldson says put out that false bad stat about there being more black men in prison than there are in college, the Justice Policy Institute. So LBS, we work with a lot of social justice issues. And over the years, we've been in a bunch of different rooms talking about a bunch of different stuff. Around 2013, 14, 15, 16, I guess, there was a big push to deal with bail. Like, bail is a system that's only supposed to help you show up for trial. It's not about punishing you or anything like that because you're not proven guilty of nothing yet. But of course, people use bail as a punishment because if you're accused of something bad, they assume you're dangerous. Or if you're black, they assume that you deserve to pay a bunch of money just to get out pre-trial. So now people are like, well, judges are racist. Let's replace the judges with an objective, statistical, computerized risk assessment. And that's going to allow us to deal with the racism of judges and get black folks out pre-trial. And the question is, what are the actual criteria you use to determine whether someone's a threat to the community or a threat to skip bail? Originally, they were using stuff like neighborhood zip code, population arrest rate, economics. And people were like, that's racist. That's just a proxy for black people being poor and being messed up. So they were like, oh, no, we've gotten woke. We fixed it. And that's when I got exposed to it. It was the 2.0 fixed woke version. That's like, oh, we're not doing the crazy stuff. No, we're doing some new stuff. You haven't heard about what we're doing. It's so not racist. They actually told me what the criteria were. And again, if you're not trained in African people's culture, it looks objective, it looks statistically valid. But when I started to listen to what they said were the proxies for pretrial flight risk and pretrial, they call it failure to appear, like appear to court, FTA. One of the metrics was, do you have stable housing? And stable housing is defined as, do you pay for it yourself or do you live with your biological family?
Oh, wow.
Now, what do we know about black folk?
Right, we have fictive kinships.
Because of our experience with slavery and our extended kinship networks, the most stable housing for a lot of black people might not be with their biological family.
Right.
It might be with their cousin that's not really their cousin.
Right.
But they have a deeper relationship than most brothers have.
Right.
So that in of itself was a metric that risked pathologizing black life.
That's interesting.
Under the guise of objective statistical, management. The other one was, do you pay your own cell phone bill? Because the idea was that you're making money, you're responsible. And I thought about that. It's like, it's the other way around. Because if you own your family plan, that means you're actually connected to your family, which means they can help you show up for trial.
Right.
So it's like literally embedded in the logic of white people's systems. The most best laid plans of white folks are, because of the cultural assumptions embedded in how they view the world, are pathologizing black life. And again, this is not right-wing philanthropy. This is leftist, woke, BLM philanthropy.
Yeah.
And these are the very people, again, that are controlling so much of the money around social justice work, around social movements, around our criminal justice reform. And I think that's why Tolson's work, when properly applied, can be really important. But so many of the black cultural nationalists romanticize a historical Africa and fail to see the ways in which this analysis can actually be applied objectively, materially to the conditions facing us today.
Yeah. Man, that's so much. There's so much to unpack there with that piece around cultural relevance and even how we decide what we're going to look at and how we're measuring things. I think I told you before about, I was looking at this study, and it's one of those things where there's a lot, it's a lot easier to serve certain lies because it feeds into what people already believe. And this study was looking at women do more housework than men, right? So generally on its face, I think people were just ready to accept that. But then when I looked at deeper, like what were they identifying as housework? It was things like cooking, cleaning, but it didn't include taking out the trash. It didn't include cleaning the gutters, changing the lights, or just mowing the lawn. Like it excluded all of these things that were housework that men were doing. So if you select they selected, it was like pre-selected, like these are the things that we're going to say count as housework. And if you're not doing that, and it just speaks to how we could frame and how we tell a story and what questions we ask and how we can make it go in a particular way or not.
Yeah. So to sort of conclude, I had a question of you, and I'm going to try to chime in as well. Because again, we like to try to leave some takeaways for our audience in terms of things they can do in their lives or just look out for. So what are some criteria, some rules that people might be able to apply or best practices for statistical literacy so that when we get these statistics around black folks, we can think of some questions to ask or some tricks to look out for?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things, right? I think definitely the source, but there's a lot of good sources and you could have information skewed. I think getting to what are the questions that are asked in the research, like the situation that I just mentioned with housework. Okay, how are they determining it? Or how you were just mentioning before, you are considered more at risk whether or not you are living with a biological kinfolk rather than a fictive kinfolk, right? And why is that? And what value system is that connected to? Whatever stat, and even with opinions, investigate the origin of that frame of thinking. What is the origin of asking the question in this way? Who does this include and exclude? I think just starting from that and just like really unpacking and investigating that, looking at multiple variables that may impact a particular condition, like we were talking about the young boys. Being lonely impact, like that hit me in my heart. Like, man, that could impact their academic achievement. Quality of life, whether or not their mom yelled at them that day. You know, these sort of things. Like my thing would just be in general, ask more questions and investigate and interrogate the questions that they are asking and how they are measuring whatever they're saying to be a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the source really matters.
Yeah.
I mean, what I do with research and debate, you can, if you know who funds an institution, you can kind of figure out what their interests are, what their methodology is. Like there are certain, like the Manhattan Institute in New York. Manhattan, it's progressive. Like, no, the Manhattan Institute, that's where broken windows comes from. That's where stop and frisk come from. So everything that come out of them is like, all right, what trick you trying to pull on me to convince people that increased incarceration and policing is good. But with that, it's like questions like who are the actual researchers? Like, where do they come from? Where do they go to school? Like, what is the school of thought that they come from? Right? Because like I said, having a researcher that is from the community that may or may not have an African-centered methodology, but has a degree of buy-in from the people that they are studying, they may get better data than the people who, not just the Manhattan Institute, but the Justice Policy Institute, which is like the more liberal, progressive, multicultural wing of philanthropy might present in front of you. Of course, there's stuff that our viewers might know in terms of sample size and the control group.
Right.
Like I was seeing something the other day that was like Marylanders believe XYZ. And like, how many Marylanders? It's like, oh yeah, 300. It's like, yeah, I don't know about that. Right. You know, because again, the Maryland population, I think it's like 8 million, something like that. So just have some idea of like the games they're playing, because people do crazy stuff with polls, man. We should probably have a whole episode just on that. They like take it's like, well, I can only get 5 black elders to respond to my poll that were like independents. But I'm going to count them as 100.
Right.
Just because I need to weight the sample effectively. Well, you may have just got 5 weird people that gave you a weird answer.
And what area did you go to get those?
Exactly.
People?
You know, it's like the classic is landlines. When you do political polling, they oftentimes don't do texting.
Right.
They're increasingly calling cell phones, but they still like to do landlines.
Yeah.
Who do you know who has a landline?
Not
who
my
do you know who
maybe.
picks up that landline?
Right.
If you're getting calls from bill collectors, you're not picking up for anybody you don't know.
Yeah.
So you're like tacitly screening out a ton of like working class, lower class people who are just not going to pick up a random call, no matter if it's a landline or cell phone.
Right.
So just all these different things kind of snowball into what appears to be objective data.
Yeah.
Really reflecting these lies, damn lies, and statistics analysis that we started off with.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to, I love that the part of the title of Tolson's book, Black people need people who believe in Black people enough not to believe every bad thing that they hear about Black people.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're trying to figure out how to not believe every bad thing you hear about Black folks, continue to watch Black Power Media, continue to engage with Leads Their Beautiful Struggle, check us out on our website, lbsbaltimore.com, and continue to journey with us as we continue to go in search of Black Power. See you soon.
Bye.